Your annual salary is $80,000. Your new lease says $2,000 a month. You divide one by the other, and the result lands exactly on the number you have heard for years: 30%. The apartment passes the rule. But your bank account does not. After taxes and payroll deductions, assume your take-home pay is about $5,000 a month. Add $220 for utilities. Add the ordinary costs that keep your life running: food, transportation, health expenses, a student loan payment, phone service, basic household costs, and the expenses that do not arrive every month but always arrive eventually. By the time you are done, the rent that looked responsible on paper can leave almost nothing available for long-term savings. No luxury car, no daily shopping spree, no missed credit card payment, no dramatic mistake, just one clean percentage telling you the apartment is affordable while the rest of your life quietly disagrees. So here is the question that matters. If your rent passes the 30% rule, how much should you actually be able to save over the next 12 months? The answer is not hidden in the rent. It is hidden in the money that remains after rent. And that is where the 30% rule starts to break. The first thing to understand is that 30% was never a law of household physics. It did not come from discovering that every family becomes financially stable at 29% and unstable at 31%. Its modern history runs through public housing policy. In 1969, the Brooke Amendment limited the amount many public housing tenants could be required to contribute toward rent to 25% of family income. In 1981, federal policy moved the standard to 30%. Today, most families receiving federal rental assistance generally pay around 30% of adjusted income toward rent, subject to program rules. That history matters because the number began as a policy standard for housing assistance. Over time, 30% also became a widely used way to measure whether households are housing cost burdened. A useful benchmark slowly became something much more powerful in everyday conversation: a personal rule. If rent is under 30%, you are doing okay. If rent is over 30%, you are spending too much. That sounds precise. It is also incomplete. Even HUD material describes the 30% definition as an approximate guideline or general rule of thumb in the broader concept of affordable housing. And the reason is simple. A percentage tells you how large one expense is relative to income. It does not tell you whether the dollars left over can carry the rest of your life. Take two households. One earns $20,000 a year. The other earns $40,000. Both spend exactly 30% of income on housing. The first household has $14,000 left before accounting for taxes and every non-housing need. The second has $28,000. Same ratio. Very different margin. Now change something else. Give one household a child who needs care. Give another unusually high medical costs. Give another a long commute because the cheaper apartment is far from work. Give another no car payment and a short walk to the office. The 30% line does not move. Real life does. That is the first reveal. The rule treats the remaining 70% as though it means the same thing for everyone. It does not. There is a second problem hiding inside the way people casually use the rule. You may be calculating base rent. Housing researchers usually calculate housing cost. Those are not always the same number. Official measures of renter cost burden typically include rent and utilities. So if you earn $80,000 a year, a $2,000 base rent is exactly 30% of gross monthly income. But add $220 in utilities, and your housing cost is now $2,220. That is about 33% of your gross monthly income before you have bought food, traveled to work, filled a prescription, or saved $1. The apartment that passed the quick internet calculation may already fail the broader housing cost test. But even that is not the deepest problem. Suppose you find a place where rent and utilities together stay under 30%. You can still have no meaningful room to save. Researchers have been trying to measure this problem with another idea: residual income. The logic is almost embarrassingly simple. Instead of asking, what percentage of income goes to housing, ask, after housing is paid, do you have enough money left for the rest of a reasonable life? That change sounds small, but it changes who appears financially strained. A 2025 analysis from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies used 202 3am Erican Community Survey data together with estimates for essential non-housing costs. The researchers found that about 2/3 of working-age renter households had what they called residual income cost burdens. Under the traditional housing cost measure, about half were burdened. More strikingly, an estimated 5.3 million renter households had residual income burdens even though the standard measure did not classify them as cost-burdened. Think about what that means. Millions of households can look acceptable when you judge housing as a percentage of income, yet still lack enough money after housing to cover a modest set of basic needs. That does not make the 30% measure useless. It makes it a different tool. It is good at answering how much of this household's income is being consumed by housing. It is weaker at answering, can this specific household afford this specific apartment and still build financial margin? Those are not the same question. And the difference becomes more important when the rest of the budget is expensive too. In 2024, an estimated 22.7 million renter households in the United States were already spending more than 30% of income on housing. That was about 49% of renters. The pressure has also moved up the income scale. Among renters earning between $45,000 and $74,999, the share considered cost-burdened reached about 49% in 2024. This is why just earn more does not automatically repair the rule. More income helps. Of course it does. But if rent, transportation, insurance, food, healthcare, and other fixed costs have all moved higher, an income that sounds solid can still produce a thin monthly margin. And a thin margin is where saving disappears. Go back to the $80,000 example. This is hypothetical, not a national average. The point is to test the rule. Gross monthly income is about $6,667. 30% gives you a base rent ceiling of $2,000. Assume take-home pay after taxes and payroll deductions is $5,000. Now add $220 for utilities. Your total housing cost is $2,220. Next come non-housing necessities. Suppose food, transportation, health costs, a student loan payment, phone service, household items, and basic personal expenses total $2,400 a month. That leaves $380. But monthly budgets are famous for pretending annual life does not exist. Car maintenance does not happen every month. Registration does not happen every month. A dental bill does not happen every month. Shoes do not wear out on a subscription schedule. A laptop does not fail politely on payday. So set aside $400 a month for irregular but predictable expenses. Now your monthly margin is negative $20. Your $2,000 rent passed the famous 30% rule. Your long-term savings capacity is effectively zero. That is not because the rent calculation was wrong. It is because the question was wrong. You asked what rent consumes. You did not ask what life requires. This is also why a high-cost renter can look financially responsible and still feel as if savings never survive. You transfer $500 to savings on payday. 2 weeks later, you pull back $150 for a medical copay and prescription. Next month, you pull back $300 for a repair. Then an annual fee arrives. Then travel becomes unavoidable. Then a tire needs replacing. From the outside, it can look like you keep failing to save. From inside the budget, something else may be happening. Your savings account has become the shock absorber for a rent decision that left too little margin. That distinction matters. If you think the problem is discipline, you attack coffee, restaurants, and every small purchase that makes life pleasant. If the real problem is structural, those cuts may create guilt without creating enough money. A $6 coffee matters if you buy enough of them. But a rent decision that is $300 too high for your actual margin matters every single month before you wake up. This is where the psychology of the 30% rule becomes powerful. Simple rules feel safe. They reduce uncertainty. You do not have to estimate every future expense. You do not have to decide how much savings is enough. You do not have to confront the possibility that the apartment you can qualify for is not the apartment that supports the life you want. You calculate one percentage. You get a green light. And once you have a green light, every later problem can feel like a personal failure instead of a signal that the original test was incomplete. There is another reason the rule is so sticky. 30% sounds like a boundary. Boundaries make decisions easier. But financial boundaries are often household specific. A renter with no debt, no car, low medical costs, and a strong emergency fund may be able to spend more than 30% on housing and still save comfortably. Another renter may spend 25% and still be squeezed because childcare, transportation, healthcare, or debt absorbs most of what remains. The ratio cannot see any of that. So the better question is not, am I above or below 30%? The better question is, what must remain after housing for my life to work? That leads to a more useful test. Start with take-home pay, not gross income. Then subtract the non-housing costs you realistically cannot avoid. Not fantasy minimum groceries. Not a transportation number that assumes nothing breaks. Not a medical budget of zero because this month happened to be healthy. Use a realistic monthly amount. Then create a reserve for irregular expenses. This is not long-term savings. It is money for costs that are unpredictable in timing but predictable in existence. Then choose a minimum savings floor. That savings floor could be $100. It could be $500. It could be a percentage. The exact number depends on your situation. The important part is that savings enters the decision before the lease, not after every other expense has already claimed the month. Whatever remains after those 3 steps is your maximum total housing cost. Then subtract utilities. Now you have a maximum base rent that protects the margin you said mattered. Run that test on our hypothetical $80,000 salary. Take-home pay, $5,000. Non-housing necessities, $2,400. Irregular expense reserve, $400. Minimum long-term savings, $500. That leaves $1,700 for total housing. If utilities are $220, your base rent ceiling becomes $1,480. Notice what just happened. The 30% rule told you $2,000. Your actual margin test told you $1,480. That is $520 a month difference. Over 1 year, that difference is $6,240. That number is the answer to the question we opened with. If you sign the $2,000 lease and every other assumption stays the same, the $500 monthly savings goal has nowhere to live. The budget is already roughly $20 short before long-term savings. The planned $6,000 of annual savings does not merely become difficult. Under this hypothetical, it disappears. And that is the real danger in treating 30% as a personal guarantee. The rule can tell you that housing is not unusually large relative to gross income, while saying nothing about whether savings can survive after taxes and necessary spending. Now, there is an obvious objection. What if $1,480 rent does not exist where you need to live? That is not a failure of the test. That is information. A good affordability test should not only approve choices, sometimes it should reveal a mismatch. Maybe the apartment market around your job is too expensive for your current income and savings goal. Maybe living farther away reduces rent but raises transportation enough to erase the benefit. Maybe a roommate changes the equation. Maybe keeping a car is more expensive than living closer to work. Maybe a debt payment is temporarily compressing your margin. Maybe you decide to save less for 1 year because the location gives you something valuable enough to justify the trade. The point is not that there is always an easy, cheaper apartment waiting. The point is that you should see the trade before signing, not discover it 6 months later through repeated withdrawals from savings. This is where the 30% rule is still useful. Keep it as a warning light. If total housing costs are above 30% of gross income, pay attention. Millions of renters experience real strain above that line, and the national data show how widespread the burden has become. But do not use the line as permission. Passing 30% is not proof that you can afford the apartment. It is only proof that one ratio passed one test. Your life has more than one test. The most important one is the margin left after housing. That margin buys more than investments. It buys the ability to absorb a dental bill without debt. It buys the ability to leave a job that becomes unbearable. It buys the ability to travel for a family emergency. It buys the ability to replace a broken laptop without turning the next 3 paychecks into repayment plans. It buys time. And when the margin is gone, a salary can look healthy while your options quietly shrink. That is why 2 renters with the same income and the same rent percentage can live completely different financial lives. One has room. The other has a ratio. So the next time a rent calculator tells you an apartment is affordable, do not stop at the green checkmark. Ask what remains. Start with take-home pay. Subtract the life you already have to fund. Reserve something for the expenses that arrive irregularly. Protect a minimum amount for long-term savings. Then see what is actually available for housing. You may discover that your number is below 30%. You may discover that it is above 30% and still workable. Either result is more useful than pretending 1% can understand your household. The 30% rule survived for decades because it is simple, comparable, and useful. But simple is not the same as complete. Housing affordability is not just the share of income your home consumes, it is the life your remaining income can still support. And if your rent passes the rule while your savings keeps disappearing, that is the signal to trust. Not because you failed the percentage, because the percentage failed to measure the part of your budget that mattered most. What percentage of your income goes to housing right now? And does the money left over actually feel like enough? If this kind of calm, practical economics helps you understand what your money is doing, subscribe and keep building the margin that lets you sleep a little easier.